Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your daily sit rep for Wednesday, the 17th of September, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway. Robert, good morning. Let's start with the latest update here on this stopgap spending bill.
Good morning, Mike. Yesterday, House Republicans unveiled their own stopgap funding bill that is going to fund the government through 21 November. It's also going to ramp up security for all three branches, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, by roughly $30 billion each. And they're planning to vote on this bill by Friday. And then there was some pushback from Democratic leaders. Minority Senate Leader Chuck Schumer said that the stopgap spending bill is, quote, steering the country straight toward a shutdown. And four Republican representatives also said they would vote against the stopgap bill if it did not include spending cuts. Representative Thomas Massey is one of those. And then I did see that there are right now behind the scenes in both the House and Senate Republican members who are trying to negotiate some kind of alternative bill that would include Obamacare subsidies to try to get some Democrat votes. But as far as I've seen, there's been no movement on this from Republican leaders. They're still saying that they're not going to put this in the stopgap bill.
Okay, so September 30th, that's the deadline, correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right, and so it still looks like there's still a large enough gap in the House and the Senate that we will, or at least in the Senate, that we're going to get a government shutdown if nothing changes.
Yeah, right now the Republican leaders in both chambers and the White House are pushing for a clean stopgap bill just to continue funding the government. And in the House, it also looks like there's some Republican resistance to that too that could impact a vote on it.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on to Hank Johnson. His latest warning is that democracy is under a 6-alarm fire. Robert, this is nothing that we haven't already heard. But what is the solution here other than removing Trump from office and putting in a Democrat president?
Well, this was at the judicial conference. It's held twice a year. Yesterday, that's headed up by Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts, and Johnson was basically warning telling John Roberts that the Supreme Court needs to step in to put a stop to what he calls the excesses of the Trump administration, because he says they're disregarding the Constitution, and that Americans are looking to the federal courts for salvation from the Trump administration. And I think this is part of what will probably become a pressure campaign on the Supreme Court, because there are a lot of signs that in some of these coming decisions that the Supreme Court, at least the conservative majority, is likely to side with the Trump administration on some key issues like immigration.
Mm-hmm. Robert, this is a very good point. Last week, we talked about, or maybe it was on Monday, we talked about Indivisible, the co-executive directors of Indivisible, which is the country's largest protest organizing group, came out and said direct pressure campaigns against the Supreme Court will probably not work or probably not be effective. And we have seen this. It is a little bit out of desperation, but we have seen Democrats talk about how pivotal the Supreme Court is going to be in pushing back against the Trump administration and the Trump agenda. And it seems like they don't have a lot of faith that the Supreme Court is actually going to do that. And I have seen some Democrats that fully expect the Supreme Court to go along with a lot of these Trump agenda items that have been held up in in federal court. And they're very worried that the Supreme Court is going to enable the Trump administration to continue to do what it's doing and maybe ramp up. Given that, Democrats obviously will have to do something. So you have Indivisible saying direct pressure campaigns, so like protesting and these noise demonstrations outside of the homes of these Supreme Court justices. They tend to doubt that's going to work. What has Hank Johnson said, or what other things have you seen Democrats say in terms of how they can persuade or influence or maybe even coerce the Supreme Court to rule against Trump?
Well, I think the main Democrat line here has been talking about packing the court, basically, if they take power again. That was one of their major criticism during the first Trump administration. They called it stacking the court.
Yeah, so Yeah, we covered that. They're going to try to do that if they retake the Senate, the House, and the White House in 2029. But between now and then, what can Democrats or these protest or activist groups do to influence or coerce the Supreme Court to rule against Trump? Because that's what they want. That is, they're basically telling us it's almost like this is their final tool here to stop the Trump administration before it goes into organized resistance. That's what I'm seeing here.
Yeah, I don't think there's much they can do aside from the pressure campaign. And like you said, some of these progressive groups that are not elected Democrats have said they don't think it'll be effective. But I think part of why they don't think it'll be effective is I think some of these groups are worried about painting a target on their back from the Trump administration. Because as we talked about previously, some of those groups like Democracy, AID, some of these Trump Resistance 2.0 organizations have said they're aware that the Trump administration is aware of what they're doing. And I think they're concerned about the Trump administration going after them more directly.
Mm-hmm. All right. I just want to point out from this year until 2028, we're looking at basically 3 phases of the establishment left campaign. So I'm not talking about the far left, like Antifa or the, insurgency or whatever you want to call these people. The establishment left has this 3-phase campaign of protest to organized resistance and then color revolution if required in 2028, 2029, if the election doesn't go their way. We're in the protest phase now. My question is, if the establishment left loses some of these major cases where the Supreme Court rules in favor of the Trump administration, like birthright citizenship, like National Guard deployments, a handful of others, if they cannot stop Trump through the Supreme Court, my previous expectation is that organized resistance in earnest will probably not start until after the midterms, because we're waiting to see if we're going to have a Democrat or Republican majority. My key assumption is that we're going to have escalation after the midterms either way, for reasons I've previously stated. But I do question, if they lose these Supreme Court cases prior to the midterms, the question is, does that accelerate organized resistance? Does organized resistance become more likely prior to the midterms? And I guess that's TBA, but that's something I'll be looking at today. Robert, any observations on that?
Well, yeah, I think that does increase the risk of some type of escalation of the Trump resistance, because they don't have really any other tool to influence the Supreme Court other than a pressure campaign. That would include things like amicus briefs to some of these cases, but the signs point to the Supreme Court likely siding with Trump. So I don't think they have another tool.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that. Let's go ahead and move on. Speaking of mid-decade redistricting, Indiana looks likely to do this as well.
Yeah, this was a statement from Indiana Governor Mike Braun, and he said that a new mid-decade congressional map in Indiana will probably happen. And he said he could call a special session as soon as early November to vote on this new map. And they are looking to flip one Democrat district in the northern area of Indiana.
Okay, so they would effectively remove one Democrat representative and create a Republican in that place. All right, let's move on. This is maybe at this point it should not be shocking, but it's shocking to me. Terrorism, so at least one charge against Luigi Mangione was dropped.
Yeah, New York judge yesterday dropped state terrorism and first-degree murder charges against Luigi Mangione. And in the ruling, the judge said that the facts of the case did not support that Mangione's intent was to threaten, intimidate, or coerce, but to, quote, draw attention to the greed of the insurance industry. In this case, the reasoning of the judge almost to me sounds supportive of Mangione, and I think the risk of this ruling by the court is that far left individuals see this as an affirmation of targeted assassination, basically as politically legitimate.
Well, let's go down this road. What is to stop the next CEO assassin from shooting dead his or her or their target and saying, I'm drawing attention to injustice? And then I mean, that according to this judge, that may remove any culpability of terrorism, even though Let's go back to the textbook definition of terrorism that we've had since 2001. It's violence or coercion to influence against civilians to influence a political outcome. It sure seems like Mangione's assassination here fits that. At any rate, what's next for Mangione, Robert?
Well, they're I guess they're the next hearing. They're going to decide what other charges that he can face, including I think in New York. Right now he's also facing a federal prosecution, which it was part of the argument for his defense of why he shouldn't face basically any charges in the state court. But they're looking at second-degree murder charges and 8 other charges that they have not said what those will be yet.
Okay, so he threw out first-degree murder. We're waiting on maybe second-degree murder charges. Correct?
Correct.
Okay, so first-degree murder, and I'm just looking this up. First-degree murder is murder with premeditation and deliberation. So is the judge saying this was a target of opportunity that Mangione didn't he like write down or didn't he mark his bullets or something like that with scrawl messages on his bullets? That's premeditation.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, he did.
Okay, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, obviously, but why in the world did this judge throw out first-degree murder? This was obviously premeditated.
I'm not sure. That's why, to me, this was the judge's reasoning here. I can see that there's a legal argument about terrorism, domestic terrorism, that specifically it's not usually something it's easy to charge someone with, and at the federal level, it's like a modifier for another crime. So I think in this case, the judge's reasoning, well, if it's not first-degree murder, then under New York state laws definitions, they can't modify that with a terrorism charge.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and move on to some more cooperation with Mexico here out of Chihuahua. That is the state of Mexico, just south of El Paso. What's the latest?
So the Chihuahua State Police conducted a tactical training course with DHS, with the Homeland Security investigations. Last week, they sent 20 state police officers from Chihuahua to El Paso. And as part of this, or after this training exercise, the Chihuahua Public Safety Director, Gilberto Loya, attended a ceremony where he said that this was an example of ongoing cooperation between Mexican and U.S. law enforcement. And he reaffirmed the Chihuahua State Police's commitment to strengthening what he called the strategic alliance on border security.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's good news. And that also fits a trend that we have seen with deepening security cooperation between the United States and Mexico, which we did not have, or we had less of during AMLO, the previous Mexican president. Robert, I just want to go back to this Mangione thing real quick. In terms of judges, we've heard from a lot of Republicans and Trump administration officials specifically talk about how bad some of these judges are. And in terms of having faith in the justice system, it sure seems like a lot of these judges are making rulings or engaging in certain decisions that are so egregious that it really does call into question the legitimacy of the courts in some cases. Do you know how these judges could be removed? I mean, I'm guessing this is probably an elected position.
Well, it depends on the state. So some states judges are elected, some states are appointed by the state Supreme Court or some other type of body within the judicial branch of that state, or by the governor. So it really depends on the state, but there are in many states an impeachment process similar to the federal process where judges can be either impeached or recalled. In some states they have recall elections for judges, I believe.
Okay. All right. And then we have some current and former New Yorkers in the chat who say, talking about Andrew McCarthy said the New York law has been changed and first-degree murder only applies for killing a police officer or a prison guard. Unverified, but Steve, thanks for that. Interesting. Also believable. All right, finally, let's move on here. MS-13 had some major arrests.
Yeah, the DEA announced yesterday that they dismantled an MS-13 cell that was operating in Nashville, Tennessee, but this cell was operating across multiple states, and they announced the arrest of 17 MS-13 members or associates across Tennessee, California, and Oklahoma. And DEA special agent in charge, Jim Scott, said that this is the first of what will be, quote, many strikes against foreign terrorist organizations operating in the U.S. So this looks like the first of probably a targeted operation going after some of these designated FTOs, which includes MS-13, Sinaloa Cartel, and Tren de Aragua, and a few other of these transnational criminal organizations.
Mm-hmm. Let me just say one point on this. I don't know. I don't follow MS-13. And I don't know what kind of outside of Latin America, like say China, for instance, I don't know what type of support or cooperation some of these cartels actually have with China. There were those illegal mining operations in Mexico run by Chinese, I believe run by Chinese nationals, but protected by the cartels, if I recall correctly. But let's go back to this December 2020 Army Facility Security Report that said, it didn't say China specifically, but it said foreign actors, i.e. China, would use transnational criminal organizations as a proxy to conduct warfare against the United States. It seems to me that the Trump administration is not just going after Tren de Aragua and MS-13 and these other TCOs because they're residing in the United States, but maybe also removing avenues for proxy warfare against the United States. Maybe that's not the main reason, but it sure seems like that's got to be part of the calculus here. Just want to throw that out there. All right, thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on to our global sit rep, starting in Colombia.
Absolutely. So the Colombian president is certain that they're losing their decertification process after the majors list released yesterday. And in response, Colombian president released several statements.
Okay, so hang on. Let's back up. What is the decertification? What is this?
Sorry, the U.S. is expected to decertify Colombia's counter-drug efforts, which we've talked about. That provides a lot of additional monetary support and weapon support for Colombia. Petro saying, okay, fine, we will no longer depend on U.S. weaponry. So that's actually going to be a major shift. He wants to either make his own, which I don't think Colombia's quite there yet, or buy others. And normally, if you're not buying U.S. weapons, you're buying French or Russian or Chinese. So there's a very significant chance we're about to see an inflow of adversary weapons into a major non-NATO ally, unless he loses that status ahead of time.
Yeah. Well, this is very important. This is something that I mentioned when this whole Colombia diplomatic rift started. One of the things I said is that the United States provides a lot of support to counter narco operations in Colombia, and we helped them dismantle FARC, which was a terrorist organization, communist terrorist organization. And I said, this is the big risk. Not only that counter drug operations cease in Colombia and U.S. cooperation on that, but also Colombia pivoting towards China, for instance.
Yeah.
Hang on, Jared. Colombia has presidential elections coming up in May of next year. I wonder at what point, and Gustavo Petro is a leftist, I wonder, and I'm just throwing this out there as a potential course of action. It's obviously speculation on my part, but I wonder if there's a scenario where Petro becomes the next Chavez or the next Maduro and tries to stay in power and maybe do all he can to prevent a centrist or even a right-wing president from being elected in Colombia, because that seems like that would be a really large pivot and can destruct everything that Gustavo Petro has done in Colombia to this point, including getting a lot more cozy with Venezuela and basically trying to build a unity state, more or less, with Venezuela. Just throwing that out there. Please continue, Jared.
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because one of his statements was in regards to this, was that the U.S. is trying to create a puppet state, and that the May 2026 election will decide between, quoting, a puppet president like the one who sold out Panama or a free and sovereign nation. So at the very least, he is laying the narrative for the scenario you're talking about.
All right.
All right.
All right. Thanks. Let's go and move on to Syria.
Sounds good. The foreign minister of Syria met with Jordan's foreign minister and U.S. special envoy Thomas Barak, and they're working on a stability plan for Syria's southern Suwaida governorate, which you can see highlighted here on the map. This is right near the area that's disputed with Israel, and it's highly unstable right now, particularly because they're still kind of transitioning away from Assad. All three nations are making commitments to Suwaida's security, stability, and unity and sovereignty. And this includes continued delivery of humanitarian and medical aid. Now, Syria is still taking the bulk of the responsibility for this, but I think it is exceptionally notable that the U.S. is still making commitments in this region.
And was this one of the regions that some Israeli officials were talking about annexing potentially?
It is right next to it. There's a governorate just to the west of Suwaida that is being partitioned by Israel, but I'll double check the greater Israel map. That's been floated around a few times, even within the Netanyahu government. So I think that would actually encompass past Damascus, if I remember right, and considerably like blow right past Suwaida.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right.
Over in the Pacific, Philippine officials met with the UK Defense Minister, Lord Coker, and the French head of their joint international staff. And Lord Coker proposed a status of visiting forces agreement similar to the one actually being proposed by the French, being discussed between the French and the Filipinos. And now these are the first two European status of forces visiting agreements with the Philippines. It'll allow a much greater presence of the European forces in the Philippines, which is acting kind of as a south central hub for the anti-China coalition. All of that will allow a much greater military support for their carrier strike groups, which are in rotation to maintain a presence with the United States carrier strike groups. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, we're going to go over to Bangladesh. The Bangladeshi foreign secretary met with his local ambassador from China, so China's ambassador to Bangladesh, and this was specifically to discuss President Xi's global governance initiative, which was announced just, I think it was late last month, maybe earlier this month. Now, Siam expressed appreciation for this. It's about all that's been published about it, but the fact that it is supportive, I think, is very important because Bangladesh is the number 3 contributor to UN peacekeeping forces. And if you want to put up a global governance initiative, you basically need to capture the United Nations, and you need a security force to enforce it. So I am going to take a much closer look at Rwanda, Nepal, and India, see what they're saying. Those are the other 3 of the top 4 contributors, and they, by and large, make the majority of peacekeeping forces from the United Nations.
Mm-hmm. All right. Bangladesh also borders India. So I wonder at what point that makes the Indians a little more nervous that their neighbor is signing on to this Chinese global governance initiative as well. You know, there's a lot of talk in BRICS, a lot of talk about BRICS being the economic alliance, and they're working in unison and et cetera, going to develop this BRICS currency, maybe. I think they probably just have some gold-backed currency, maybe. At any rate, there's still a lot of dissension. And even a couple of weeks ago, we saw this big thing about President Trump said the United States has lost India to Chinese influence. There are still huge divisions between India and China. So this is not just, I would just point out that there's pictures of them holding hands or, chumming it up or whatever at this SCO meeting or wherever it was. But Jared, what is the latest on that, by the way? Have you seen it?
I haven't seen much more there. And you are right to point out that there are enormous divisions. Chinese rejuvenation is the main thing to keep in mind here. And that includes parts of India, all of Mongolia, parts of Russia. All of these people that China's trying to woo right now, they eventually want to take territory back from them. So on a long enough time scale, this is not going to go well for India or Russia.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. All right, moving on. This is interesting. The guys were pointing out this morning, there are 112 protests today. That is way above the average, way above a baseline, especially just for a Wednesday. I'm not sure it's indicative. And honestly, I think a lot of these protests, exist in a spreadsheet somewhere, or exists online as being scheduled. There may not even be some people turning up to this. I keep looking in my area to see if eventually there's going to be one of these protests pretty close to me. I'm going to drop by and see who all's out there. The last one I went to, there's like 15 people there max, and it lasted for less than 2 hours. So again, most of these protests are pretty small. That said, it's called a National Day of Action coming up on Saturday on the 20th. I think it's going to be pretty piddly. And just to remind everyone, the Labor Day protest, they estimate 500,000 people turned out, which is not nothing. I mean, that's like a really good protest turnout. But they were shooting for way north of 500,000. Also coming up on October 18th, we're just a month away here. That Saturday is going to be the No Kings 2.0 protest. And they want it to be even bigger than the 3 million they turned out for No Kings 1 back on June 14th. So we await that. I think that's a really good measure of growth and urgency of participation. But remember, the biggest benefit is not actually the mobilization and the turnout. By far, the biggest benefit for Indivisible and also for Democrats is that Indivisible is building an army. They're going to protests today. Next year, they will be organizing and getting people to the polls to help Democrats take back the House. This is my big concern, and the absolute biggest driver, or part of my reasoning, why I think escalation is coming after the midterms regardless. If Democrats retake the House, they're going to pursue this inside-outside strategy, and I think we're going to see the left, quote-unquote, take back the streets, or try to. If Republicans keep the House majority, is almost certainly going to be because of mid-decade redistricting. They're going to call that Congress, the left is going to call that Congress, and any laws they pass, illegitimate because of how these seats were taken away from Democrats and given to Republicans in these red states. And that's going to give them I think that's going to be a huge driver of them turning out. And this is why I think they moved to organized resistance after the midterms. We've seen a little bit of this now, but very low level. Like the chains where they get out there and hold hands and sing Kumbaya and make an 8-mile chain in Ohio. Apparently they're trying to do something in California, holding hands all across the state from north to south, this unbroken human chain. Maybe they can do it. I don't know. That's pretty silly. But it shows solidarity. And if they can do things like this, I think it is encouraging to some on the left. And it also gives them some level of experience in organizing, because if you can manage something like that, then surely you can get some of them to take the next step and go from hand-holding and kumbaya singing into an occupation or chaining themselves to a barricade or whatever kind of occupation or direct action demonstration we see after the midterms. So with that, that's going to do it for today's daily sit rep. We're about to jump over to the high side for our members only early warning briefing. If you'd like to join us for that, do head over to forwardobserver.com/trial. Sign up for a free 7-day trial. Catch the rest of this report. We're going to talk about this Senate minority and the latest from Joe Manchin. We're also going to talk about mobilization. So Senator Chris Murphy, back in March, if you recall, he said some pretty incendiary things at a town hall meeting. I'm going to remind you of everything he said and then talk about why that matters in light of his most recent call to mobilize. With that, we are going to go ahead and jump over. So we appreciate your support, and early warning, folks, please stand by.